Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling completely drained, even though the other person seemed perfectly pleasant? Have you found yourself questioning your own sanity after dealing with someone who claimed to care about you? What I'm about to share with you might fundamentally change how you see the people in your life, and more importantly, it might just save your psychological well-being. The most dangerous individuals you'll encounter won't carry weapons or make obvious threats. They'll smile at you. They'll claim to love you. They might even be family members, close friends, or romantic partners. Carl Jung, the brilliant Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human mind, spent decades studying these hidden predators who feast on our psychological energy. Today, we live in a culture that teaches us to see the good in everyone, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to be understanding and compassionate. Social media reinforces this with endless posts about toxic positivity and universal love. But Jung would tell you that this naive approach leaves you vulnerable to serious psychological harm. Not because people are inherently evil, but because most people are unconscious of their own darkness, and when someone refuses to face their own shadow, that darkness seeks a host. Often, that host becomes you, the unconscious reality that controls our lives. Let me start with Jung's most important insight, one that will frame everything we discuss today. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This principle doesn't just apply to your own psyche. It applies to every relationship you form, every interaction you have, every person who enters your life. When you fail to recognize the unconscious patterns driving others, you become an unwitting participant in their psychological dramas. You become the stage upon which they act out their unresolved trauma, their unintegrated shadow material, their deepest fears and wounds. And here's the kicker. They don't even know they're doing it. Think about the people in your life who leave you feeling confused, drained, or somehow diminished after spending time with them. These aren't random encounters. These are individuals whose unresolved psychological material is actively shaping your reality. They're projecting their unhealed wounds onto you, using your empathy as a weapon against your well-being, and feeding off your energy to sustain their own psychological dysfunction. Jung identified specific archetypal patterns that these individuals follow. They're not conscious villains plotting your destruction in some dark room. They're unconscious people whose unintegrated psychological material makes them dangerous to your mental health and spiritual development. They operate from what Jung called complexes, constantly terminating clusters of psychological energy that can take over their personality and drive their behavior. Today, I'm going to walk you through 8 distinct types of psychologically dangerous people that Jung's work reveals. But here's what makes this different from typical relationship advice. I'm not going to tell you these people are simply toxic and you should avoid them. I'm going to show you the deep psychological mechanisms that drive their behavior, why you might be unconsciously attracted to them, and how to protect yourself while developing genuine compassion for their struggle. Because here's the truth Jung discovered. We don't randomly attract these relationships. There's something in our own unconscious that draws us to specific types of psychological danger. Understanding this isn't about blame, it's about freedom. It's about breaking the unconscious patterns that keep us trapped in relationships that drain our life force and distort our reality. Type 1. The unconscious manipulator. Masters of emotional puppetry. The first type is perhaps the most insidious because their manipulation is completely unconscious. These people have become so disconnected from their authentic emotional experience that they literally cannot survive psychologically without making others carry their disowned feelings. They've developed what Jung would call a dissociated personality structure, where they've split off from their own emotional reality. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine someone who consistently makes you feel responsible for their emotional state. When they're angry, it's because you provoked them. When they're sad, it's because you disappointed them. When they feel insecure, it's because you're trying to make them feel inferior. When they're anxious, it's because of something you did or didn't do. This isn't conscious blame shifting. They genuinely believe their version of reality. The unconscious manipulator operates through what Jung called projection, one of the most powerful and dangerous psychological mechanisms. Everything they cannot accept within themselves gets cast onto you, They've constructed their entire identity around avoiding self-examination, so they require you to be the container for all their unwanted psychological material. Their weapons are subtle but devastatingly effective. They practice emotional gaslighting, making you question your own reality with phrases like, "You're being too sensitive," "You always take things the wrong way," or, "I never said that, you must be remembering wrong." They have selective memory, remembering events in ways that always cast them as the victim or the misunderstood party. Their version of truth shifts based on their mood, and every problem in their life originates from external sources, never from their own choices or patterns. Here's why this is so psychologically dangerous. Jung understood that we don't randomly attract these relationships. The unconscious manipulator seeks out specific psychological vulnerabilities. If you grew up believing your worth was tied to helping others, you'll be magnetically drawn to someone who seems to need constant emotional support. If you're committed to personal growth, you might assume others share your commitment to self-awareness, making you vulnerable to someone who uses psychological language to avoid actual psychology. If you tend to question your own motives and take responsibility for relationship problems, you become an easy target for projection. If you desperately want harmony and avoid conflict, you'll often sacrifice your own reality to maintain peace with a manipulator. They can sense these vulnerabilities unconsciously and will exploit them without even realizing what they're doing. The neurological impact is severe and measurable. Chronic exposure to manipulation literally rewires your brain, making you more likely to doubt your own perceptions. Recent neuroscience research supports Jung's intuitive understanding of how manipulation affects the mind. You find yourself in a state of chronic hypervigilance, constantly monitoring your words and actions, trying to predict their mood shifts. This psychological state prevents you from accessing your own inner wisdom and authentic emotional responses. Breaking free requires what Jung called conscious realization. You must learn to distinguish between your authentic emotions and those induced by their projections. You need to start reality testing your perceptions with trusted friends who can provide objective feedback. You must document interactions to see recurring themes that might not be obvious in isolated incidents. Most importantly, you must rebuild confidence in your own emotional responses and perceptions. The key insight Jung offers is that the unconscious manipulator isn't intentionally trying to harm you. They're unconsciously trying to survive their own unprocessed psychological material. But understanding their unconscious motivation doesn't obligate you to remain their unwitting container for projection. You can have compassion for their struggle while protecting yourself from becoming collateral damage in their psychological war. Type 2. The persona prisoner, living behind the mask of perfection. The second dangerous type has become completely identified with what Jung called the persona, the social mask we all wear to navigate different situations. The persona is necessary and healthy. The version of ourselves we present at work naturally differs from how we are with intimate friends. But when someone becomes completely identified with their persona, losing touch with their authentic self, they become what Jung called inflated with their own mask. These individuals appear to have everything together. They're successful, well-liked, always perfectly composed and appropriately dressed. They say the right things at the right times, laugh at appropriate moments, and seem to effortlessly navigate social situations. They're the people others point to as having figured it out. But beneath this polished exterior lies a soul in exile, completely cut off from spontaneous feeling and genuine connection. The persona prisoner has spent so much energy maintaining their perfect image that they've forgotten who they actually are beneath the performance. This isn't simple vanity or superficiality. It's a complete psychological defense system, built around avoiding vulnerability, authenticity, and the messy reality of human emotion. They've turned their life into a 24/7 performance because they believe that's the only way to be acceptable or lovable. Living with a persona prisoner means existing in a world where authenticity is treated as a threat. Every interaction becomes a carefully choreographed performance, where deviation from the script is met with discomfort or subtle punishment. Your sadness, anger, fear, or confusion makes them visibly uncomfortable, forcing you to either suppress these natural states or deal with their anxiety about your humanity. They respond to authenticity with immediate advice or solutions, effectively invalidating your emotional reality. Instead of simply being present with your experience, they jump to fixing whatever you're feeling. They hold themselves and others to impossible perfectionist standards that leave no room for human error, learning, or growth. Conversations remain surface level, focused on achievements, appearances, and socially acceptable topics while avoiding anything that might reveal vulnerability or uncertainty. What makes this psychologically dangerous is what Jung called the contagion effect. Spending significant time with someone who cannot tolerate authenticity gradually trains you to suppress your own genuine responses. You begin self-editing, monitoring your words and expressions to avoid triggering their discomfort with reality. You start experiencing emotional numbing, gradually shutting down your spontaneous feelings to maintain harmony in the relationship. You develop performance anxiety, feeling pressure to present a polished version of yourself rather than simply being who you are. Eventually, you begin to feel guilt about wanting genuine emotional connection, as if there's something wrong with you for not being satisfied with surface-level interaction. The collective shadow aspect is crucial here. Jung recognized that our culture actively participates in creating persona prisoners through its obsession with image, success, and emotional suppression. Social media has amplified this tendency exponentially, rewarding curated perfection while punishing authentic struggle. The persona prisoner often emerges from family systems where love was conditional on performance. Children who learn that acceptance came through achievement, compliance, and emotional regulation often grow into adults who mistake their persona for their identity. They genuinely don't know who they are when they're not performing, which creates a terror of authentic self-impression that gets projected onto everyone around them. Jung's solution involves what he called individuation, the gradual integration of all aspects of personality, including those that don't fit the ideal image. Breaking free from relationships with persona prisoners requires modeling authenticity regardless of their discomfort, expressing your real feelings even when they don't fit their sanitized version of relationship, and declining to apologize for your humanity or accommodate their inability to handle authentic emotion. Type 3. The shadow denier. When repression becomes rage. The third type represents one of Jung's most revolutionary insights about human psychology. These individuals have constructed their entire identity around being good, controlled, rational, spiritual, or morally superior. They pride themselves on their discipline, their ability to rise above base emotions, their commitment to being positive or enlightened. But this cultivation of light has come at the cost of completely disowning their darkness. Jung understood that psychological health requires integration, not elimination, of our shadow aspects. The emotions, desires, and impulses we try to completely suppress don't disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, gaining power and eventually demanding expression in increasingly destructive ways. The shadow denier has turned this natural psychological process into a pressure cooker that eventually explodes onto everyone around them. Many shadow deniers hide behind spiritual or psychological language, using concepts like love and light, positive thinking, or letting go as weapons against their own authentic emotional experience. They've turned spirituality into another form of emotional suppression, creating what modern psychology calls spiritual bypassing. This pseudo-enlightenment becomes dangerous when they project their terror of negative emotions onto others. They become the emotional police in their relationships, uncomfortable or judgmental when others express anger, sadness, fear, or frustration. They respond with phrases like, "Don't be so negative," "You're creating your own suffering," or "Everything happens for a reason." They insist on finding silver linings or lessons in every painful experience, effectively invalidating the natural process of grieving or processing difficulty. They position themselves as more evolved or conscious than those who openly struggle with difficult emotions. And they become overwhelmed when life inevitably presents challenges that can't be positively thought away. When this happens, they often blame others for their distress, rather than acknowledging their own emotional reality. Here's what makes them psychologically dangerous. Because the shadow denier has no healthy outlet for their disowned emotions, these feelings build pressure until they explode in disproportionate reactions. Someone who has spent years presenting as calm and controlled suddenly erupts in rage over a minor inconvenience. Someone who claims to have transcended anger becomes vindictive and cruel when their carefully constructed image is threatened. These explosions are particularly damaging because they come without warning. Since the shadow denier doesn't acknowledge their building frustration or anger, there are no opportunities for others to address issues before they reach crisis point. the reactions are completely disproportionate to the trigger, because years of suppressed emotion pour out in response to relatively minor events. During these eruptions, all their disowned shadow material gets projected onto whoever is nearest, making them temporarily the repository for years of denied emotion. Afterward, they often minimize what happened, blame others for making them react, or claim they weren't themselves. This denial perpetuates the cycle and prevents any real healing or growth from occurring. Many shadow deniers use moral superiority as their primary defense against acknowledging their own darkness. They become the ethics police in their relationships, constantly pointing out others' flaws while remaining blind to their own. This moral inflation allows them to project shadow material while maintaining their self-inflated as spiritually or ethically superior. Living with a shadow denier creates a psychological minefield where you never know what minor action might trigger their explosive eruption. Their discomfort with negative emotions pressures you to suppress your own authentic feelings. Their need to maintain moral superiority means your natural human struggles become evidence of your spiritual or psychological inadequacy. Their inability to acknowledge their own shadow creates a relationship dynamic where your perceptions of their behavior get consistently invalidated. Jung's approach was radically different from most psychological and spiritual systems. Rather than trying to eliminate negative emotions, he advocated for conscious integration, acknowledging, understanding, and finding healthy expression for all aspects of the psyche. Breaking free requires refusing to suppress your authentic feelings, to accommodate their discomfort with reality, examining and integrating your own shadow so you don't unconsciously enable their denial, and maintaining connection with people who can help you stay grounded when their projections become overwhelming. Type 4. The energy vampire, the unconscious thief of vitality. The fourth type represents what happens when unresolved psychological material becomes autonomous, taking over the personality and driving compulsive behaviors. Energy vampires have what Jung called uncontained psychological complexes that create a constant need for external energy to maintain their psychological equilibrium. They've become so disconnected from their own internal resources that they require others to provide the emotional energy they cannot generate themselves. This isn't simple neediness or temporary crisis support that we all occasionally need. It's a fundamental inability to self-regulate that turns every relationship into an extraction operation. The energy vampire has learned to unconsciously position themselves as the perpetual recipient of care, attention, and emotional labor, without offering genuine reciprocity. Many organize their entire identity around what Jung called a victim complex, a psychological structure where powerlessness becomes their primary tool for controlling others. Jung understood that complexes operate autonomously, meaning the person doesn't consciously choose to be a victim. They've become so identified with this role that it runs their entire personality. The victim complex serves multiple psychological functions that make it incredibly difficult to break. It guarantees attention because crisis and suffering reliably draw others' focus and concern. It avoids responsibility because powerlessness exempts them from being accountable for their choices or circumstances. It manipulates others through guilt because people feel selfish for having boundaries when faced with someone's proclaimed helplessness. It resists change because remaining stuck preserves the familiar dynamic where others provide energy and support. Their conversations follow predictable patterns that become recognizable once you know what to look for. They present the same problems repeatedly without implementing suggested solutions, creating endless loops that go nowhere. When your attention wanes, they unconsciously escalate their drama or discover new emergencies that require immediate focus. They resist every suggestion with yes but responses, ensuring the problem remains unsolved and the conversation continues. They engage in what I call emotional dumping, unloading their feelings without checking your capacity or interest in receiving them. They treat you like an emotional garbage disposal, expecting you to absorb their chaotic energy without reciprocation. They rarely ask about your life, and if they do, they quickly redirect the conversation back to their concerns. The neurological impact of chronic exposure to energy vampires is severe and measurable. Their uncontained emotions keep your sympathetic nervous system activated, leading to adrenal fatigue as your body's stress management resources become depleted. You experience emotional dysregulation as absorbing their chaotic energy disrupts your own emotional equilibrium. Your attention becomes fragmented as their urgent demands scatter your focus and prevent deep concentration. Your boundaries gradually erode, as repeated guilt and pressure weaken your ability to maintain healthy limits. From Jung's perspective, psychological energy, what he called libido, is sacred life force that should be consciously directed toward growth, creativity, and authentic connection. Energy vampires represent a misuse of this vital resource, unconsciously appropriating others' life force to maintain their own psychological dysfunction. This isn't about judgment, it's about recognition and protection. When you allow your energy to be consistently drained by others' uncontained complexes, you rob yourself of the vitality needed for your own individuation process. You become so depleted managing others' chaos that you lose connection to your own creative potential and spiritual development. Some energy vampires operate through what Jung might recognize as martyr complexes, where their suffering becomes a form of currency that others are expected to honor through attention, service, or accommodation. They've learned that pain grants them special status and exempts them from normal social expectations. They compete in suffering, unconsciously one-upping others' problems to maintain their position as the most afflicted. They reject joy because positive experiences threaten their identity as the long-suffering one. Breaking free requires developing what Jung called conscious realization about energetic exchange. You must learn to recognize when your vitality is being drained and take immediate protective action. You need to set clear limits on how much emotional labor you're willing to provide and maintain them despite guilt or pressure. You must insist on reciprocal exchange rather than one-sided emotional dumping, and consciously choose to invest your vital force in relationships and activities that enhance rather than deplete your life force. Type 5. The moral controller. Righteousness as psychological weapon. The fifth dangerous type has turned spiritual or ethical ideals into weapons of control, rather than tools of genuine development. Moral controllers represent what Jung called the shadow expression of righteousness, someone who has turned their unintegrated moral complex into a system for manipulating and dominating others. They've become inflated with what Jung termed the moral complex, an unconscious identification with being right, good, or spiritually superior. This inflation serves as a defense against acknowledging their own shadow material, while simultaneously providing a sense of power and control over others. They've confused their personal preferences, cultural conditioning, or psychological wounds with universal moral truth. Jung understood that when we cannot acknowledge our own capacity for selfishness, cruelty, or error, we must project these qualities onto others. The moral controller has perfected this projection process, consistently discovering in others the very qualities they refuse to see in themselves. By focusing on others' moral failures, they avoid examining their own shortcomings while maintaining their sense of spiritual or ethical superiority. Many hide behind spiritual or religious language, using concepts like karma, divine will, or spiritual law to justify their controlling behavior. They've turned whatever spiritual tradition they follow into a weapon rather than a path of genuine transformation. They present their personal opinions as divinely inspired or spiritually revealed truth. They use concepts of cosmic justice to explain why others deserve their suffering while exempting themselves from such scrutiny. They position themselves as more awakened or conscious than others, creating spiritual hierarchy rather than spiritual community. Their primary tool is guilt generation, the sophisticated ability to make others feel bad about their natural human impulses, needs, or choices. They've learned that guilt is one of the most effective methods of behavioral control, and they deploy it with unconscious precision. They establish impossible moral standards that ensure others will fail and feel inadequate. They consistently question others' motivations, suggesting hidden selfish agendas behind innocent actions. They use examples of more righteous people to make others feel spiritually or morally inferior. They make others feel selfish for having boundaries, needs, or desires that conflict with the controller's preferences. Jung recognized that moral inflation often creates rigid black-and-white thinking that cannot tolerate complexity or nuance. The moral controller lives in a world where actions are either completely good or completely evil, where people are either righteous or sinful, where spiritual practices are either pure or corrupted. This psychological splitting creates severe problems in relationships and personal development. Complex human situations get reduced to simple moral categories that don't reflect actual circumstances. When others don't fit their pure categories, all the messy humanity gets projected as evil or wrong. The inability to tolerate moral complexity makes genuine intimacy impossible. Their own disowned material grows stronger as they maintain increasingly impossible standards of purity. Some moral controllers develop what Jung might recognize as a prophet complex, unconsciously positioning themselves as spiritual guides or moral teachers while being completely unaware of their own psychological blind spots. They gather followers or admirers who mistake their moral inflation for genuine wisdom. This pattern is particularly dangerous because their unconscious shadow material guides their teaching, leading others away from genuine development. Living under moral tyranny creates a psychological environment where spontaneity, authenticity, and natural human impulses become sources of shame and anxiety. You find yourself constantly self-measuring, checking your thoughts, feelings, and actions against their moral standards. You absorb guilt for normal human experiences like anger, sexuality, ambition, or self-care. You suppress aspects of yourself that don't fit their ideal of righteousness. Their external judgment becomes internalized as harsh self-criticism that follows you even when they're not around. Jung's approach to dealing with moral controllers involves recognizing that their righteousness is actually a defense against their own disowned shadow material. True morality includes humility, compassion, and the recognition that we all contain both light and shadow. When someone cannot acknowledge their own capacity for error or selfishness, their moral teachings become psychological weapons rather than genuine wisdom. Breaking free requires developing moral relativism, recognizing that their moral standards are personal preferences, not universal truths. You must develop immunity to guilt tactics by learning to distinguish between genuine ethical concerns and manipulative pressure. You need shadow compassion, recognizing that their moral inflation is a symptom of their own unhealed psychological wounds. Most importantly, you must develop your own authentic ethics, based on genuine values, rather than fear of judgment. Type 6. The complex reactor, when trauma controls the present. The sixth type represents someone whose unintegrated trauma has created multiple autonomous complexes that erupt unpredictably, making them emotionally volatile and psychologically dangerous to be around. This builds on Jung's most significant contribution to psychology, his understanding of complexes as autonomous psychological fragments that can take control of consciousness and drive behavior independent of rational will. Jung discovered that when traumatic experiences overwhelm the psyche's ability to integrate them consciously, these experiences become encapsulated as complexes, autonomous clusters of emotion, memory, and meaning that operate outside conscious control. The complex reactor has multiple such fragments that can be triggered by seemingly innocent present-moment events, causing them to react, not to current reality but to unresolved past experiences. These individuals often appear normal or even charming between episodes, making their sudden personality shifts particularly jarring and confusing. One moment they're present and connected, the next moment they're completely taken over by a complex, reacting with an intensity and irrationality that seems to come from nowhere. It's as if different people inhabit the same body, each with their own emotional reality and perception of events. Living with a complex reactor means walking through a psychological minefield where normal interactions can suddenly activate their unintegrated trauma. Because these triggers often make no logical sense to outside observers, you find yourself constantly confused about what caused their dramatic reaction. Common trigger patterns include abandonment complexes activated by any perceived withdrawal of attention or affection, causing them to react with panic, rage, or manipulative behavior designed to prevent imagined abandonment. Authority complexes get triggered by anything that feels like control or dominance, causing explosive reactions to normal boundaries or requests. Victim complexes are activated by feeling criticized or challenged, causing them to position themselves as attacked or persecuted, even when receiving neutral feedback. When a complex is activated, the complexed reactor experiences what psychologists call time collapse. Past trauma floods into present awareness with such intensity that they cannot distinguish between then and now. They're not reacting to you or the current situation, they're reacting to historical wounds that have been triggered by present circumstances. This psychological phenomenon explains why their reactions are disproportionate to the current trigger. The emotional intensity matches the original trauma, not the present situation. Logic doesn't work because they're operating from a regressed psychological state, where rational thought is overridden by survival responses. They can't hear you during complex activation because their ability to process new information is severely compromised. They seem like different people because the complex has temporarily taken over their personality, displacing their normal consciousness. When complexes are activated, the complex reactor's perception of reality becomes severely distorted by projections from their unhealed past. They see threats that don't exist, interpret neutral actions as attacks, and experience current relationships through the lens of historical betrayals. They claim to know your motivations or intentions, usually projecting negative meanings onto innocent actions. Their distorted perceptions become presented as objective reality, making you question your own sanity. Many complex reactors develop what I call an addiction to crisis, because emotional intensity feels familiar and even comforting compared to the anxiety of normalcy. Their nervous systems have become calibrated to chaos, making peaceful interactions feel threatening or boring. They unconsciously create conflict when things become too calm, manufacture emergencies from minor issues, mistake emotional volatility for passion or depth, and feel anxious during periods of peace and stability. When overwhelmed by complex activation, they often employ psychological splitting, seeing people as either completely good or completely bad with no middle ground. During idealization phases, when you're meeting their needs, you're perfect and can do no wrong. During devaluation phases, when triggered, you become evil and the source of all their problems. These perceptions can change within hours or even minutes, leaving you confused and emotionally whiplashed. Relationships with complex reactors often create what psychologists call trauma bonds, psychological attachments formed through cycles of intensity, crisis, and reconciliation. These bonds can feel incredibly strong because they activate our own attachment systems in powerful ways. The unpredictable mixture of love and chaos creates addictive psychological patterns. Their obvious pain triggers our desire to help and heal, making us feel uniquely important. Jung understood that psychological states are contagious. Spending significant time with someone whose complexes are constantly activated will eventually affect your own nervous system and emotional regulation. You develop hypervigilance, constantly monitoring their mood and potential triggers to avoid explosions. Your own emotional regulation becomes compromised by their chaos. You begin questioning your own perceptions and sanity as their intense projections become overwhelming. Their unhealed wounds can trigger activation of your own unprocessed psychological material. The key insight about complex reactors is that their trauma responses are automatic and unconscious. They're not choosing to be difficult or manipulative. The complexes operate autonomously, temporarily taking over their personality during activation. However, understanding their psychology doesn't require enduring psychological abuse or sacrificing your own mental health. Sometimes the most compassionate response is recognizing that you cannot provide what they need and encouraging professional support while protecting your own well-being. Type 7. The charismatic narcissist, the inflated ego's seductive mask. The seventh type represents what Jung called narcissistic inflation, where individuals become identified with grandiose archetypal images, losing touch with their human limitations and authentic self. The charismatic narcissist has perfected the art of making their narcissism feel like a gift to others, disguising their need for admiration and control as charisma, leadership, or special insight. Jung understood that narcissistic inflation occurs when the ego identifies too strongly with archetypal energies, the hero, the sage, the lover, the creator, without maintaining connection to human vulnerability and limitation. The charismatic narcissist has become possessed by these archetypal images, believing themselves to be the embodiment of whatever archetype they're channeling, rather than someone who occasionally accesses these energies. Unlike the obvious egomaniac who repels people with their arrogance, the charismatic narcissist has learned to present their narcissism as attractive and beneficial to others. They've mastered the art of making you feel special for being chosen by someone so exceptional. Their ego inflation is disguised as confidence, their manipulation as mentorship, their exploitation as mutual benefit. They begin relationships with what psychologists call love bombing, an intense seduction phase that Jung would recognize as archetypal possession in action. They temporarily embody the perfect lover, mentor, or friend, creating an intoxicating experience of being seen, chosen, and valued in ways you've never experienced before. During this seduction phase, they demonstrate mirroring mastery, reflecting back your dreams, values, and desires with uncanny accuracy, making you feel understood in unprecedented ways. They bring overwhelming attention and energy to the relationship, making ordinary connections pale in comparison. They engage in future faking, painting elaborate pictures of your shared destiny that make you feel chosen for something extraordinary. They project idealization onto you, treating you as perfect and special, temporarily inflating your own ego in ways that feel amazing. The charismatic narcissist requires constant narcissistic supply. Narcissistic attention, admiration, validation, and energy from others to maintain their inflated self-image. They've learned sophisticated methods of extracting this supply while making it feel like you're receiving something valuable in return. Conversations become platforms for their adventures, insights, or achievements. They position themselves as authorities on topics you're interested in, making you dependent on their knowledge and perspective. They gradually become the source of your good feelings, making you dependent on their approval or presence for emotional regulation. Over time, they make themselves central to your self-concept and life narrative, so that your identity becomes intertwined with your relationship to them. Once they've secured your attachment and dependency, their true nature begins to emerge. The person who once made you feel special and chosen gradually reveals that your value to them is entirely conditional on your ability to provide narcissistic supply. This transition is often so gradual that you don't notice it happening until you're already deeply invested. During the devaluation phase, your flaws become magnified while your strengths are minimized or ignored. They use other people to make you feel inadequate or replaceable, comparing you unfavorably to others who seem to better meet their needs. The attention and validation that initially hooked you gets strategically withheld, creating anxiety and desperate attempts to regain their approval. They rewrite the history of your relationship to diminish your importance or contributions, making you feel like you imagined the initial connection. They have developed such an elaborate false self that they've lost contact with any authentic core. Their entire identity is constructed around managing others' perceptions and extracting validation. Everything about them is calculated for effect rather than authentic expression. They simulate appropriate emotions rather than feeling them genuinely. They cannot afford real intimacy because it would threaten their inflated image. Others exist primarily as sources of supply rather than separate beings with inherent worth. Charismatic narcissists are masters at creating trauma bonds that make leaving feel impossible. They understand how to create psychological addiction through intermittent reinforcement and manufactured scarcity. Unpredictable rewards create addictive attachment patterns similar to gambling addiction. They make their attention and approval feel rare and valuable, like winning a prize. They become so central to your self-concept that leaving feels like losing yourself. They provide just enough positive reinforcement to maintain hope for return to the seduction phase. Our current culture's obsession with celebrity, success, and personal branding creates ideal conditions for narcissistic inflation to flourish. Social media amplifies narcissistic tendencies by turning validation metrics into measures of worth, replacing reality with carefully crafted personal brands, creating constant comparison culture and treating follow accounts as measures of human value. Recovery from narcissistic relationships involves reclaiming your authentic self after being used as a mirror for someone else's inflation. This requires reality restoration, reconnecting with objective truth about yourself and the relationship. You must reclaim your identity, rediscovering who you are apart from their projections and demands. You need to reconstruct healthy boundaries and learn to protect yourself from future narcissistic exploitation. The trauma created by manipulation and devaluation must be processed and healed. Most importantly, you must rebuild connection with your genuine needs, feelings, and desires, rather than those manufactured by their influence. Type 8. The idealizer devaluer. The split mind's emotional whiplash. The eighth and final type operates from what Jung recognized as psychological splitting, the inability to hold both positive and negative aspects of people simultaneously. The idealizer devaluer creates relationships characterized by emotional whiplash as they oscillate between seeing others as perfect saviors and terrible villains, with no middle ground or complexity. This splitting pattern serves as protection against the anxiety of complexity and ambiguity, but it creates havoc in relationships and prevents genuine intimacy from developing. The idealizer devaluer operates from what Jung would recognize as a primitive psychological defense, where reality gets divided into absolute categories of good and evil, perfect and worthless, angel and demon. This black and white thinking often originates from early trauma, where the individual learned that people were either completely safe or completely dangerous, with no middle ground for normal human complexity. They never developed the psychological capacity to hold nuance, to see that the same person can be both loving and flawed, helpful and harmful, worthy of appreciation and occasionally frustrating to deal with. When the idealizer devaluer first meets someone who triggers their attachment system, they project onto that person all their unmet needs for the perfect parent, lover, friend or mentor. During this idealization phase, you can do no wrong. Every quality is magnified in the positive direction. Every action is interpreted through rose-colored glasses. Every interaction feels magical and destined. The idealization process includes projection of perfection, where they see in you qualities you don't actually possess, creating an impossible standard to maintain. They engage in future fantasy, imagining a perfect relationship based on their projections rather than actual compatibility or realistic assessment. They project their unmet needs onto you, unconsciously expecting you to fulfill roles that no human relationship can realistically provide. They experience red flag blindness, ignoring or rationalizing away any evidence that contradicts their idealized image of you. Because the idealization is based on projection rather than reality, it's guaranteed to collapse when you inevitably reveal your human limitations. The trigger for devaluation can be surprisingly minor. Expressing a different opinion, having a bad day, setting a boundary, or simply failing to meet an unconscious expectation you didn't even know existed. When the idealization shatters, the idealizer devaluer doesn't adjust their perception to include complexity and nuance. Instead, they swing to the opposite extreme, now seeing you as completely bad, selfish, or worthless. The same intensity they brought to idealization gets directed toward devaluation with equally unrealistic and extreme perceptions. During the devaluation phase, they project onto you all their disowned shadow material. Everything they cannot accept about themselves gets displaced onto you. You become the repository for their unconscious self-hatred, disappointment, and rage. They reinterpret your entire relationship through the lens of current disappointment, revising history to support their new negative perception. Problems in the relationship become entirely your fault, rather than mutual challenges requiring shared responsibility. They may withdraw emotionally, attack your character, or sabotage the relationship to express their disappointed rage. Being in relationship with an idealizer devaluer creates a specific type of psychological trauma, characterized by emotional whiplash. You experience identity confusion as the radical shifts in their perception make you question who you really are. You develop performance anxiety, becoming hypervigilant about maintaining their approval to avoid the crushing experience of devaluation. The unpredictable shifts trigger your own nervous system activation and stress responses, leading to emotional dysregulation that can persist even when you're apart from them. Their intense projections make you doubt your own perceptions and memories, creating a form of gaslighting that's particularly insidious because it's not consciously intended. You find yourself walking on eggshells trying to maintain the idealized version while knowing it's impossible to sustain indefinitely. The cycle of idealization and devaluation creates a powerful psychological addiction, similar to gambling addiction. The intermittent reinforcement of returning to idealization creates hope that keeps you engaged despite the painful devaluation phases. The memory of how amazing it felt to be idealized creates hope that if you just try harder, behave better, or love them more completely, you can maintain that perfect connection. This creates what psychologists call trauma bonding. The intensity of both phases creates powerful emotional bonds that feel like deep connection, but are actually addiction to the neurochemical highs and lows. You assume responsibility for the devaluation, believing you can control their perception through better behavior. You develop rescue fantasies, believing your love and understanding can heal their splitting pattern and create lasting stability. Jung's concepts of anima and animus, the unconscious feminine and masculine aspects of the psyche, become crucial in understanding the idealizer devaluer. They often project these unintegrated archetypal images onto romantic partners, seeing them first as the perfect anima or animus figure, and then as its shadow aspect, when reality fails to match the projection. This projection includes archetypal overlay, where you're seen not as yourself but as the carrier of their internal archetypal image. They hold unconscious expectations for you to fulfill roles and needs that belong to their internal psychological development rather than external relationship. They use external relationships to avoid the work of integrating their own inner masculine and feminine aspect. This creates psychological dependency, as they become addicted to external sources for what should be internal psychological wholeness. The splitting serves multiple unconscious functions that make it resistant to change. It manages overwhelming emotions by simplifying complex feelings into black and white categories. Idealization attempts to ensure the other person won't abandon them by making them perfect and special. Devaluation creates distance when closeness becomes too threatening or intimate. Projecting badness onto others maintains their sense of being the victim rather than taking responsibility for relationship dynamics. Living with an idealizer, devaluer, means existing in a state of chronic hypervigilance, never knowing what minor action might trigger the shift from idealization to devaluation. You find yourself self-censoring, monitoring your words and actions to avoid triggering their disappointment. You engage in constant people-pleasing, trying to maintain their positive perception through performance rather than authentic connection. Gradually, you lose touch with your authentic self as you try to be whatever they need you to be in each moment. The constant vigilance and emotional intensity depletes your psychological resources, leaving you exhausted and confused about your own identity and worth. Jung recognized that cultures can also engage in splitting, creating collective patterns of idealization and devaluation. We see this in celebrity culture, where the public builds up celebrities only to tear them down when they reveal human flaws. Political polarization demonstrates our collective inability to see complexity in public figures or positions. Spiritual community dynamics often follow the pattern of guru idealization, followed by dramatic disillusionment. Social media creates rapid shifts from viral praise to cancel culture destruction. Breaking free from splitting relationships requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in consciousness simultaneously. Recovery involves complexity acceptance, learning to see yourself and others as containing both positive and negative qualities, rather than being all good or all bad. You must learn to withdraw projections, recognizing when you're being used as a screen for someone else's unconscious material, rather than being seen as a complete person. Emotional regulation becomes crucial, developing the capacity to stay grounded during their emotional storms without being pulled into their splitting dynamic. Boundary maintenance protects you from their projections while refusing to take responsibility for their internal splits. You cannot heal their capacity for psychological complexity through perfect behavior or unconditional love. Professional support is often necessary because severe splitting patterns usually require therapeutic intervention to address the underlying trauma and developmental arrests that create this defensive structure. The mirror of self-recognition, examining our own shadow. Now that we've explored these 8 dangerous archetypal patterns, we arrive at perhaps the most challenging part of this journey. Jung's most radical insight was that we cannot fully protect ourselves from unconscious manipulation until we become conscious of our own unconscious patterns. Each of the dangerous archetypes I've described represents not just external threats, but potential shadow aspects within our own psyche. This is where the real work begins, and where most people want to turn away. It's easy to identify these patterns in others, to feel righteous anger about how we've been treated, to see ourselves as victims of others' unconscious behavior. But Jung would ask you to go deeper. He would ask you to examine honestly whether you've ever been one of these people yourself. Have you ever used guilt or emotional manipulation to get your needs met when direct communication felt too vulnerable? Have you hidden behind a perfect image to avoid the messiness of authentic connection? Have you projected your unresolved issues onto others rather than doing the difficult work of self-examination? Have you drained others' energy when you were in crisis, treating them as emotional dumping grounds rather than human beings with their own needs and limitations? Have you used moral superiority to control or judge others, positioning yourself as more evolved or conscious to avoid looking at your own shadow? Do your unhealed traumas sometimes control your reactions, causing you to respond to present situations through the lens of past wounds? Have you exploited others' admiration for narcissistic supply, even in subtle ways? Do you split people into all good or all bad categories when you're disappointed, unable to hold the complexity of human nature? This self-examination isn't about self-criticism or shame. It's about developing the psychological honesty that makes genuine relationship possible. When you can acknowledge your own capacity for unconscious harm, you develop authentic compassion for others' struggles while maintaining appropriate boundaries for your own protection. Jung understood that our outer world often mirrors our inner landscape. The people who trigger us most intensely often reflect our own disowned psychological material. This doesn't mean you're responsible for their behavior or that you deserve mistreatment. It means that understanding your own unconscious patterns helps you recognize and respond to these dynamics more consciously. If you grew up in a family where love was conditional on performance, you might be unconsciously attracted to persona prisoners because their emotional unavailability feels familiar. If you learned to equate worth with helping others, you might repeatedly find yourself in relationships with energy vampires who exploit your caretaking tendencies. If you have unresolved authority issues, you might be drawn to moral controllers who recreate the dynamic of trying to earn approval from critical parental figures. If you have abandonment fears, you might tolerate the chaos of complex reactors because any connection feels better than being alone. The relationship revolution, choosing consciousness over chemistry. Understanding these psychological patterns requires revolutionizing our approach to relationships. Most people choose partners, friends, or colleagues based on chemistry, convenience, or unconscious psychological patterns that feel familiar. But Jung would encourage us to begin choosing based on consciousness rather than comfort. Instead of being drawn to people who trigger our psychological wounds, we can learn to recognize and be attracted to psychological health. This means looking for consciousness level. Does this person demonstrate self-awareness and genuine commitment to personal growth? Do they take responsibility for their impact on others and show willingness to examine their own behavior when conflicts arise? Emotional regulation becomes a crucial indicator of relationship health. Can they manage their own emotions without making others responsible for their internal states? Do they have healthy outlets for processing difficult feelings, or do they consistently dump their emotional chaos onto others? Accountability capacity reveals whether someone is capable of genuine relationship. Do they take ownership of their mistakes and work to repair harm when they cause it? Can they apologize authentically without defending their actions or making excuses? Do they show genuine remorse when their behavior hurts others? Boundary respect indicates emotional maturity and respect for others' autonomy. Do they honor your limits and needs even when it's inconvenient for them? Can they hear no without becoming manipulative or punitive? Do they support your individual growth even when it challenges the relationship dynamic? Reciprocity patterns reveal whether the relationship enhances both people's lives or primarily serves one person's needs. Is there mutual give and take, or does energy consistently flow in one direction? Do they show genuine interest in your life, dreams, and experiences, or is the relationship primarily focused on their needs and experiences? Complexity tolerance demonstrates psychological maturity and the capacity for genuine intimacy. Can they hold nuance and ambiguity without splitting into black and white thinking? Are they able to see you as a complete person with both positive and negative qualities? Can they work through conflict without vilifying you or making you all bad when disappointed? Shadow integration reveals the deepest level of psychological development. Are they willing to examine and own their own darkness, or do they consistently project their disowned material onto others? Can they acknowledge their capacity for harm and take responsibility for their unconscious patterns? The spiritual dimension, protection as sacred practice. From Jung's perspective, protecting yourself from psychological manipulation isn't selfish, it's a spiritual practice. Your psychological energy is sacred life force that should be consciously directed toward growth, creativity, and authentic connection, rather than unconsciously drained by others' unresolved complexes. This spiritual approach to psychological protection includes energy consciousness, treating your vitality as precious and being selective about how you invest it. Just as you wouldn't give your money to anyone who asked, you shouldn't give your psychological energy to anyone who demands it without reciprocation or respect. Boundary sanctity means viewing healthy limits as sacred self-care, rather than selfish withholding. Your boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They're banks of a river that keep your energy flowing in healthy directions, rather than flooding into places where it's not appreciated or reciprocated. Discernment development involves cultivating the ability to sense psychological health or dysfunction in others before becoming emotionally invested. This isn't about judgment or superiority. It's about recognizing compatibility and protecting yourself from relationships that require you to sacrifice your well-being. Authentic expression means refusing to suppress your true self, to accommodate others' unconscious needs. When someone requires you to be less than who you are to make them comfortable, they're asking you to participate in their psychological dysfunction. Compassionate detachment allows you to love others without taking responsibility for healing them. You can have empathy for their struggles while maintaining healthy boundaries around their unconscious patterns. The collective healing, creating conscious community. Jung understood that individual healing and collective healing are intimately connected. As more people become conscious of these destructive psychological patterns, we can begin creating communities and cultures that support authentic development rather than unconscious manipulation. This collective healing involves modeling healthy relationships by demonstrating what conscious connection looks like. When you refuse to participate in unconscious dynamics, you create space for more authentic interaction. You support others' growth by encouraging people to do their own psychological work, rather than enabling their dysfunction. Creating safe spaces means building communities where authenticity is valued over performance, where people can be real without being punished for their humanity. Teaching psychological literacy helps others recognize and understand these patterns so they can protect themselves and make more conscious choices. Challenging toxic norms means refusing to participate in cultural patterns that reward unconscious behavior. When we stop enabling manipulation, projection, and emotional vampirism, we create pressure for people to develop healthier ways of relating. Integration and wholeness, beyond good and evil. Perhaps Jung's most profound teaching is that psychological health doesn't come from eliminating negative qualities, but from integrating them consciously. The goal isn't to become perfect or to find perfect people. It's to develop relationships where both light and shadow can be acknowledged and worked with constructively. This integration approach means embracing complexity in yourself and others. Everyone contains both positive and negative potentials, creative and destructive impulses, loving and selfish motivations. Psychological maturity involves accepting this complexity rather than trying to eliminate it. Choosing growth means prioritizing relationships with people committed to conscious development over those who are comfortable with unconscious patterns. This doesn't mean rejecting people who are struggling. It means choosing to invest your energy in relationships that support mutual evolution. Practicing forgiveness requires distinguishing between healthy forgiveness that promotes healing and toxic forgiveness that enables continued harm. True forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abusive behavior. It means releasing resentment while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Maintaining standards means holding high expectations for how you allow yourself to be treated, while remaining humble about your own capacity for unconscious harm. You can insist on respect and reciprocity, while acknowledging your own ongoing need for growth and healing. The ultimate protection, becoming whole. Jung's final insight about protection from psychological danger is that the best defense is becoming whole yourself. When you've integrated your own shadow, developed emotional regulation, and learned to meet your own needs, you become far less susceptible to others' unconscious manipulation. This wholeness includes self-acknowledge, understanding your own patterns, triggers, and vulnerabilities so you can recognize when others are exploiting them. Emotional independence means being able to regulate your own feelings without requiring others' validation or approval for your sense of worth. Authentic expression involves living from your true self rather than performing for others' approval or trying to be what you think they want you to be. Spiritual connection means maintaining relationship with meaning and purpose beyond human relationships, so you're not dependent on others for your sense of value or direction. Healthy attachment involves forming secure bonds that enhance rather than complete you. When you're whole within yourself, you can offer genuine love without losing yourself in the relationship. The call to consciousness. As we conclude this exploration of Jung's insights into psychological danger, remember that this knowledge comes with both power and responsibility. You now have the tools to recognize unconscious manipulation and protect yourself from psychological harm. But with this awareness comes the obligation to use it wisely. This isn't about becoming cynical or suspicious of everyone around you. It's about developing the discernment to distinguish between conscious and unconscious people, between relationships that support your growth and those that drain your life force. It's about having the courage to choose psychological health over psychological familiarity. The path forward isn't about finding perfect people or becoming perfect yourself. It's about choosing relationships that support mutual growth, authentic expression, and conscious connection. It's about having the courage to walk away from dynamics that require you to sacrifice your psychological health for others' comfort with unconsciousness. In Jung's vision, the ultimate goal of psychological development is individuation, becoming the unique, whole person you're meant to be. This journey requires both solitude for inner work and relationship for love and growth. By learning to recognize and protect yourself from these 8 dangerous archetypes, you create space for the kind of conscious relationships that support rather than sabotage your journey toward wholeness. The choice is always yours. Remain unconscious and vulnerable to psychological manipulation, or develop the awareness and boundaries that allow you to love deeply without losing yourself. Jung's work offers us the map. It's up to each of us to walk the path towards psychological sovereignty and authentic relationship. Remember, you deserve to feel safe in the presence of other human beings. You deserve to be seen and loved for who you truly are, not used as a projection screen for others' unconscious material. You have both the right and the responsibility to protect the sacred space of your own psychological development from those who would unconsciously consume it for their own unmet needs. The shadow may be inevitable in human nature, but it doesn't have to rule your relationships. Choose consciousness over unconsciousness. Choose growth over comfort. Choose the difficult but rewarding path of authentic connection over the familiar patterns of psychological dysfunction. Your future self, and all those whose lives you touch, will thank you for the courage to see clearly and love wisely. The journey towards psychological wholeness is not for the faint of heart, but it is the only path that leads to genuine peace, authentic love, and the profound satisfaction of becoming who you were truly meant to be. In the end, Jung's greatest gift to us is not just the ability to recognize psychological danger, but the understanding that by facing our own darkness, we can finally step into our light. By becoming conscious of the unconscious forces that have been directing our lives, we can finally write our own story, one based on authentic choice rather than psychological compulsion. The shadow among us is real, but so is the light within us. Choose to nurture that light, protect it from those who would unconsciously extinguish it, and share it with others who are ready to see. This is how we heal, not just individually but collectively. This is how we create a world where psychological health is valued over psychological manipulation, where authentic connection becomes possible, and where love can finally be free from the distortions of unconscious. The work begins now. The choice is yours.